Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm Dan Singer. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey, and I lead our sports practice. I have since 2003. And we're very excited to be here today to talk about sales DNA, which my colleague Ben Von Willer will lead us through in just a second. I wanted to introduce our panelists. We have Steve Paman, who is the head of sports and entertainment marketing for JP Morgan Chase. They are the proud partners with Chase Field in Arizona, the U.S. Open of tennis, the Lord's Cricket Ground, which I know you're all passionate supporters of, Madison Square Garden, the Jets, the Giants, the Bears, the Magic, and many other pro and non-pro teams. He was the vice president of business development for the NFL before that, where we had lots to talk about together, and he was the SVP of marketing at HBO before that, that's Steve Paman. Also, Sam Zussman, who is an SVP and Managing Director of IMG Performance. That's over 700 people. It's a leader in the world in terms of helping athletes develop themselves. And it importantly includes IMG Academy, which is the world's largest and most successful multi-sport training academy. One of the things that Sam has done with IMG Academy is created partnerships with Gatorade and others to create performance institutes that are co-located with the academy. Ben Von Willer leads our our sales DNA initiative. He's also a member of the McKinsey sports practice. So without ado, let's get going.
Thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, everyone. So there's been huge innovation in recent times in the use of data and statistics to help understand what drives performance of athletes. We think you can do the same thing to understand what drives performance off the field with sales teams, and we call it sales DNA. And this is a topic that actually really matters. Unlike other parts of an organization where performance variance is roughly maybe 30% in an operating function, in sales you typically see a 3 to 4x differential between high and low performers, and there's a ton of lost opportunity in that gap. So what's the big idea? We think you can use data analytics to actually provide powerful insights into what explains that individual performance variance I was talking about in a sales team. And we look at that across a whole host of variables, right? So a great sales organization will find people who have the right personality intrinsics. They'll build the right skills in those individuals. They'll nest them in the right sales culture, and they'll find the right ways to motivate them so that they get to their maximum potential. How do we do that? Well, we take individual performance data from the organizations we work with, and Dan alluded to the teams and leagues we've been working with in sports. We take individual performance data, and we then marry that with survey and in some cases behavioral data at the individual level, intersect those two data sets, slice and dice it, run the correlations, and try and find the traits that actually matter to explain that performance variance we see. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes. As Dan mentioned, we'd looked at sports sponsorship sales organizations. I'm going to take a couple of minutes to share with you some of the findings from the first round of work we've done, and then I'm going to invite my panelists actually to share their thoughts and reactions. So firstly, what's the personality profile of a successful sports sponsorship seller? Well, we tested a whole host of variables across sort of every facet of personality. Let me take a moment or two to orient you on how to read this chart, and then I'll talk about what it's saying. So you'll see a bunch of horizontal bars. Those horizontal bars represent the self-reported average score normalized to a scale of 100 from the population of respondents. You'll also see that in a couple of cases, those bars are color-coded a darker blue. That dark blue represents a trait that at least had a moderate level of significance in its correlation to the performance variance. You'll also see in one of these cases, there's a double click. And that's because we actually test not just at the level of the variables on the left, but we can also get to subdrivers and see which of the subcomponents actually was interesting in explaining the difference. So you'll see here things like curiosity, resilience, conscientiousness, emotional stability just don't differentiate high and low performance in a sports sponsorship organization. There are actually two things that do: empathy and then extroversion. And extroversion is actually not a surprise. There's a lot of research that says sales organizations, this is actually a personality trait that really matters. And you can double click on extroversion and you'll see actually the facet of extroversion that really pops in explaining that performance difference is assertiveness, or the sort of predisposition to confidently state opinions and points of view and take control of the situation. Empathy is interesting because it was inversely correlated with the performance we see. So in other words, the more empathetic you were, the less likely you were to perform, and vice versa. So you may be wondering, what were the types of questions we asked to get underneath this? So I've put some of them up on the screen and let you read them. So empathy is all around, how moved am I by my counterparty's situation? How much sympathy do I feel for them? How much am I thinking about their emotional state? And assertiveness is things like, I'm the first guy to act, I'm forceful in my words and deeds. We also looked at motivations, which you see on the left-hand side of the chart here. And we looked at two types of motivations. We looked at intrinsic motivation, which is, the source of motivation is actually coming from within me. And we looked at extrinsic motivation, which is external stimulus that's actually getting me, motivating my behavior. And you'll see that things like meaning, belonging, growth, while actually may score pretty high in the way the respondents were grading them, actually don't relate to the performance variance we see. And one thing really does, and that's rewards. And this actually, we've seen in every Salesforce we've done this in, not just sports sponsorships. The age-old adage that sellers are coin-operated really appears to be true. This is a very consistent trait, and I'll show you the questions that we asked at there. So I like the idea of my pay being contingent on my performance. Maximizing my comp is what guides what I do. The best reward for a job well done is a cash prize or a bonus. Right? This is very much getting at the heart of how I'm paid. The other half of this slide, we looked at sales culture, right? So the environment in which the individuals were operating. And you'll see there's a second darker bar underneath the light blue bar. And this, we also have a benchmark of B2B consultative sales, like sports sponsorships, and we can show you how other organizations in the benchmark have scored these cultural traits. And you'll see here that a couple of things pop on the cultural side. One of the interesting ones was leadership. Not only did this pop as moderately significant, it also shows the self-reported scores are lower than others in the benchmark. The second dimension here is supportive environment, and this is basically how bonded and supported sellers feel by the organization and the co-workers. And you can see that the questions that were asked there. On the leadership front, my manager actually cares about my long-term development. They'll go with me on a sales call to help me develop my skills. And in supportive environment, it's how much I'm valued, how much I'm supportive, the level of trust in an organization. Lastly, we also test skills. And you'll see on this slide a whole host of variables that you might imagine could be relevant in a sales organization. Product knowledge, relationship and network building, pipeline management. They don't matter, at least if you are looking at the results as we see them. 3 skills actually popped. Value proposition delivery, which is a seller's ability to say why me to a prospective buyer, why you should buy from me. And within that, 2 things in particular of multiple sort of sub-facets. Competitive knowledge, so their understanding of competitors' offerings and their ability to position theirs against that context, and then the ability to cross-sell and upsell. Negotiation and closing, which I think is probably pretty self-explanatory, and prospecting, but within prospecting, 2 things in particular. Prioritization, which is the ability to look at a whole host of potential opportunities and focus your time on the ones, and resources actually, on the ones that matter. And identification, which is your ability to identify which of those opportunities are going to close when, and who you need to be talking to in the sales or in the buying organization to move it forward. So I've given you a whirlwind overview of the results of the work we're doing. I'm going to leave, guys, on the screen a little summary of what I've just discussed. And I'm now going to kick it over to the panel. And Sam, I'm going to ask you the first question. Your organization is part of the results I just shared, not all of them, obviously. What's your reaction? I mean, does it feel like you're looking in a mirror, or does it feel like you're looking at folks you don't know?
Yeah, I initially actually thought that was mine. But yes, I would say it was very telling. So it was a mirror, but it sort of took a second to recognize that it was you, and then it took a couple of seconds to recognize why. But once you recognize why, there were a few ahas, a couple of statements I'll make. The notion that people want to be rewarded. Every single score in the intrinsics is higher. Every individual single score is higher than I want to be rewarded, but turns out that reward really matters. You know, sort of tells you that what people believe, what people say or what people believe about themselves is actually different than a little bit of how they behave. But for me, the most insightful one, and that was the one that sort of took me a couple of seconds to understand, was this notion of empathy being inversely correlated, coupled with, in my situation, the empathy was in the motivation, and in the skill set, there were other questions that pertained to listening, understanding customer needs, and so on. And it turns out that over there was a correlation to being understanding, being conversant, being a listener. But intrinsically, if you were empathetic, well, that was actually bad. And so when I thought about it for a second, it seemed to me like a wide receiver. I called it hardcore soft hands, in the sense that you need to show empathy, but you can't take it in too much, because then you're negotiating against yourself and you're compromising your position. And that is something that we can immediately take real action on, both in terms of who we recruit as well as how we train.
So Steve, how many sponsorship proposals do you see a year?
A year? Well, I think, to be honest with you, it's almost incalculable. I mean, I honestly see at least 5 a day. And that's me. When I talk about our team, I think we're probably averaging 20, 25 a week, most of which I don't see. I tell people the pyramid, and then I'll get to how I feel about this, because I have some pretty strong views. But honestly, the pyramid is literally for every 100 proposals that we see, about 85 of which don't even really make it past an email or a quick glance. The rest of the 15, about 10 of which we actually investigate along with our partners, 5 of which I'll deem approval enough to go to our senior management and talk about, and then only 1 we'll actually even have serious discussions on. So it's very, very akin to applying to a top-notch school of sorts in terms of your odds. So it's far lower than baseball averages, to use that metaphor. But given that environment, the one thing I would say was actually it's very interesting to me, because it actually highlights probably the reason why that ratio is as bad as it sounds. Is quite frankly, I think that there's a real differentiator that I would love all sales folks to understand between basically what I would call your mega sponsorship deals and quite frankly your everyday sponsorship deal. So the way we get pitched, let's call it left field signage for a random ballpark in the country, is fundamentally different than we're going to be the principal sponsor of, say, the IOC or the Olympic Games package. Those are 2 totally different sales processes, 2 totally different streams of thought, and quite frankly, 2 totally different salespeople. For the pitches that J.P. Morgan Chase is now looking at, which are some mega sponsorships, there the whole organization sells us. This isn't a salesperson. So part of the reason why I think about looking at your data is that when we get approached by salespeople, usually it's we're just too for what we're trying to do, that just isn't the right approach. When we get approached by an organization, actually the empathy and a lot of the things that differentiates on a negative side actually are very much a positive, because we don't look at sponsorships. Once you start to talk about it, I won't get into the numbers, but the types of relationships we have with the Madison Square Garden, for example, that's not a sponsorship, that's a partnership, right? And once you start talking about partnerships where you're talking about more than 5 years, more than, say, $20 to $50 million a year, that's something that I don't approve, right? That a salesperson or EVP of sales doesn't approve at a property. That's something that's a board of directors level on both sides. And I think if you were to go to the board of directors and you would say what's important and what's not, they would differentiate from that. Now, that being said, I do think that there's another level of sponsorship, which is the upsell. So we buy a particular sponsorship, and then we have opportunities to activate and do different things that aren't in the contract along the way. And I would actually say that I think this is pretty on point in terms of how effective that is. And the one reason I would say that is because the empathy is thought of, or lack thereof, as a negative, when in fact we're buying passion and fandom. So the whole nature of sponsorship is I'm basically betting that your support of a particular fan group will translate over into my brand's characteristics. But if I don't think you support it, I don't think you believe in it with your whole heart, to the point where it may be nonsensical, which a lot of fandom is. You know, there's no point in time where someone should dress up as a particular cartoon character, go and rent out an ice cream truck, paint it green, and literally serve ice cream in frigid weather to Philadelphia Eagles fans for 6 hours before a game. But that's what some people do. So we look for that level of passion, right, in the property, because if you don't have it, then it's hard for me to believe you're going to be able to translate it to our brand. So that, I think, in fact, does bode well for your findings.
So, Sam, how subjective is the process of sort of selecting and then training sales teams today? I mean, is it a decision based on gut, or how is it done? Both picking who to hire, but then also what to sort of train them to do and which skills to build?
I do honestly think it's a gut decision. And there's a second order question of what actually gets factored in a gut decision, right? But when I hire people, and when the people that I hire people, I like to say I'm looking for brain power and for firepower. And I remember one situation where somebody walked into an interview, and I was sort of in a relatively jokingly mood, and I asked him, so do you want the light, the moderate, or the intense version of this interview? And the guy said, the moderate. And the interview was pretty much over. I mean, I went through the motions, but what the guy basically said is, hey, I don't really want to be challenged. I don't think I want to work that hard. And so I think it's a gut decision, but I think a lot goes into it. What you do want to see, I can agree with Steve more, is that you want to see a person going the extra mile. You want to see a person truly understanding in a mega thing, which really is a partnership. This is something that actually CEOs discuss. I'm not even sure that the initial introduction happens with a salesperson or a business development person, but even sort of in the medium level where it might be a small partnership, but it is a partnership, you really need somebody who will truly understand the business of the other person and would give the confidence that the extra mile is going to get done. And I think that gut or not, is what you're actually looking for in the hiring process.
And so when you look at data like this, I'm sort of curious, what would you do Monday morning, right? So you've just seen the data for your sales force.
Yeah.
How do you use it? What would you do differently sort of Monday?
Yeah, so, I told Dan last night I expected this to be intellectually stimulating, but I didn't know whether it was going to be highly actionable. And it was. Surprisingly, it was a pleasant surprise that it was highly actionable. There were two things that you can see from the surveys, and there was one that you needed to understand how to read the survey. One thing that you understood from the survey is where you're systematically underperforming. And that has to do with, whether it's nature or nurture in terms of hiring or training, that's across the board, and you have to look inwardly to sort of fix that. The other was a situation of variance. So we got a second tier of data into this, which was actually the variance. And when you see a significant variance there, that's also training and how you hire, but that's equivalent to stock picking, right? So that really is truly honing it in. And while we couldn't specifically see who responded what, it was actually pretty evident apropos looking in the mirror. And then the third thing, which you just needed to read, is that if you are very good as a baseline across something, it actually doesn't come across as correlated to performance because everybody is good at it as an organization. So you just really need to make sure that you're not dismissing that as an insignificant dimension, rather just that's one I'm doing well, but don't stop emphasizing that.
So, Steve, sponsorship's a pretty dynamic marketplace. The ante is rising kind of daily. When you look at this gives you a snapshot of today. When you look at where the puck's going, what is a sponsorship seller going to need to look like? What's driving the bar, and then what's the sponsorship seller going to need to look like?
I would actually say, it's pretty apparent. Of those 100 proposals, I think a sponsorship salesperson is going to have to end up being much more of a business development person. And I think those words have been interchangeable, right? Sales and business development, but they actually mean completely different things. You think about sales, you think transaction, so it's very binary. Business development is more about a relationship over time. And when you start talking about what differentiates, I was thinking about, roughly 100 proposals I see. If I were able to sort of redact them and show them to you guys right now, what you would see is that the value proposition, delivery, this whole idea of negotiating and closing, very few of them actually ask for anything, right? It's actually hilarious. It's like you will literally get a 30-page presentation from some of the biggest sports brands in the world. 15 pages will be obvious things like, we're the baseball team in fill-in-the-blank market, right? As if you've never heard of them before, right? We've won fill-in-the-blank as if their record isn't in the newspaper right now. And by the way, every team is about to win, has won, or is one step away from winning. Or I love the rebuilding with a strong focus on winning, right? So those are always in the no one actually says, hey, we're actually doing fairly mediocre. We'll be that way for a while and just sort of trust us, right?
We'd appreciate your business.
Which is 90% of all sports teams. But, so you end up in a situation where you spend a half hour reading essentially the obvious, not understanding, well, actually, A, what do they want from me, right? What does being a sponsor mean? Right? Because that can mean something completely different. What does it mean? What are the requirements on my half? Not only cash, but non-cash, right? Because we only have a certain amount of resources that we can devote to different things. So I have to prioritize those. And then, by the way, and this is something that, I've talked to Dan and the folks at McKinsey about, which is still shocking to me. The number one thing no one does is recognize we already have a portfolio of sponsorships. So how does your sponsorship fit within that context, right, and balance us out? It would be the equivalent in a financial environment if I'm trying to sell you a stock, but I don't understand your portfolio already. Apple could be the greatest stock in the world, but if you're weighted heavily towards tech, you might want, a BP or something like that to balance out. But we always end up with every pitch is a binary thing, buy us or nothing. When if we're one of the biggest sports sponsors in the world, A, we probably already have something similar, and B, it doesn't take a rocket scientist just to even put 3 bullets down and say, what makes us unique? And I would tell you, that part of prospecting is so weak to me because you can just Google what our portfolio is, and in 30 seconds, you got it. But very rare, I've probably seen, in all seriousness, out of maybe 200-300 pitches, I've seen references to our other partners in maybe 3.
And the thing that's so important there is that sponsorship sales is actually a conceptual sale.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
It is very, very different. If you sort of add the spectrum of sales and business development, a sponsorship is probably here.
Yes.
And in understanding that conceptual sale and understanding what are the needs of the sponsor and the brand association and how you might activate, it truly therefore leads to a partnership. If you don't feel that you're actually almost on equal footing. I know one person writes the check and the other actually deposits it, but if you're not almost on equal footing in your relationship because you care so much about your sponsor and how you activate, it's never going to work and it's never going to sell.
Yeah, and it goes back to what we're talking about assertiveness, right? You know, it's like interviewing for any job. We want to understand you've done your research, right? So to think if we've seen all these proposals, right, you know, that we can't tell when you've just hit find and replace, when you've literally taken out Bank of America and just inserted Chase, right? You know, it's kind of hilarious, right? To think we don't talk, to think also too, that even the fact that, you know, Sam is on the sales side and I'm on the buy side, we're both McKinsey alum, that we wouldn't talk and compare notes. So this whole thing is a big agapoly, right? So it actually rewards those folks who have a differentiated sales proposition. But, you know, quite candidly, I think, you know, unfortunately, a broken clock is still right twice a day.
Yeah.
Even though we have such bad performers, these assets are in such demand. Let's face it, the fans really do enjoy this. The material is such where it's DVR proof, and a high tide lifts all boats, that you don't have the negative compensation, I think, for a lot of bad performance that you would have in other industries.
So speaking of assertiveness, the timekeeper is letting me know we are now out of time. So I'd like you to join me in thanking our participants today for joining the panel. Thank you, guys.